But in Italy 400 years ago, I would also have needed the approval of the Vatican. Until the 16th century, the papacy tolerated scientific ideas that contradicted the Bible. But by the late 1500s, the Protestant Reformation had emerged and was accusing the Catholics of forsaking the true word of God. In response, the Vatican ruled that anyone who contradicted Catholic doctrine was a heretic. And so began science's darkest hour. Just a stone's throw from St. Peter's, this forbidding building is the papal police station. It's the notorious Inquisition, set up in the 16th century to defend against heresy. Scholars who speculated about the nature of the world could find themselves branded heretics. In the late 1500s, one of the most original thinkers was a man named Giordano Bruno. While studying for the priesthood, Bruno became captivated by Copernicus's theory that the Earth orbits the Sun. Is it fair to say that reading Copernicus's book set the stage, as it were, for Bruno's own ideas?
It must have, because Copernicus, in a way, opens up a new world for knowledge. And Bruno says Copernicus stopped at the sphere of the fixed stars, and Bruno goes past the 8th, 9th, 10th, and however many spheres you'd like to name. He thought there were other Earths. He thought there might be creatures on these other Earths. And that's one of the issues that gets him in trouble with the Church, because if there are multiple Earths, how many Earths is the Pope of?
In 1600, the Inquisition had Bruno burnt at the stake. He wasn't a real scientist, but his death was a huge blow to the emerging scientific movement. Would it be fair to say that what happened in this square, the execution of Bruno, had a very serious impact on Italian science?
It's devastating, I think, for both science and for the Church. One, it makes controversial ideas dangerous. Secondly, it makes publication of controversial ideas dangerous.
I think Bruno's execution marked the beginning of a battle between faith and reason. The dangers I faced for my science came from a small group of fanatics. But during the Renaissance, most threats to scientists had the backing of the mighty Catholic Church. This is the Inquisition Handbook of Torture, 1643. Oh, it's volume 1, actually. You know, the Inquisition might not have invented these kinds of horrendous techniques, but they certainly adopted them with relish, not only to force confessions from those who were accused, but quite frankly, to put the fear of God into everyone else. Questioning Catholic dogma could have fatal consequences. In Italy, fear of the Inquisition forced scientists underground. Those brave enough to speak out were quickly silenced. Seems very likely that poor Bruno had a contraption like this clamped on his head just before he was burnt at the stake. It's an interesting device, really. It clamps around the neck, like that, and this thing pushes down on the tongue to stop the victim proclaiming against the church at the moment of death. And what it's resting on is a papal whipping block. Knowledge of things like this must surely have terrified people. I mean, the worst that a scientist can expect these days is they get their paper rejected from the journal they send it to, or maybe their grant application gets turned down. Well, in poor Bruno's day, this is what might have happened to you. In the 17th century, the Catholic Church still insisted that the Earth was the centre of a universe that was only a few thousand years old. But today, scientific evidence has forced it to change its views. After a successful academic career, Guy Consolmagno became a Jesuit brother and is now one of the Vatican's official astronomers.
So, this is the meteorite lab, and this is where the working collection
serious.
Yeah. We think these things were made 4.5 billion years ago in a solar nebula of gas and dust. But what turned the dust into a solid rock? Nobody knows.
Can I just pick you up on one thing you said, just a throwaway remark about events that were happening 4.5 billion years ago.
Right.
To say that doesn't raise the slightest concerns in your mind, the slightest doubts. You are totally aligned with cosmological estimates of the age of the universe. And
Absolutely, of course.
Yeah.
The point of the Bible is not the science of it. The Bible's not a science book. I've written science books. The one thing you know about a science book is that it goes out of date after about 3 years. The Bible's been around for 2,500 years. For what it says, it's not out of date.
Well, no, but
so it's not a science book.
Isn't it the Word of God?
It is not the dictated word of God, God whispering this into some scribe's hand who's writing it down. We're not Muslims. It's not the Quran. It is a human interpretation of divine inspiration.
400 years ago, it was another astronomer who'd caught the Vatican's attention. Galileo Galilei was one of the most respected scientists in Europe. He helped the Vatican set up its first observatory in Rome and taught astronomy at the finest universities in the Catholic world. In 1609, he even introduced the Church to a new invention, the telescope.
Oh,
that's
like
wonderful.
the entire universe.
Yes. Wonderful.
The telescope, of course, was first really demonstrated to the world by Galileo as an astronomical telescope in January of 1609. And one of the first things he did was to bring it to the Jesuits at the Roman College, and Galileo is feted as a great conquering hero.
What the Vatican didn't realize was that Galileo's new observations of the stars, planets, and their moons supported the heretical views of Copernicus. They confirmed that the Earth was not at the center of God's universe. Galileo announced his controversial discoveries, hoping that his friend, the Pope, would protect him. Instead, he was tried for heresy. By a vote of 7-3, Galileo was found guilty. He was shown the instruments of torture. He was a 69-year-old man with severe arthritis, and he decided to confess. He said, "I abjure, curse, and detest my errors." Galileo, arguably the first true scientist, was condemned as a heretic. It was a disaster for science.
The real tragedy of Galileo wasn't just that he was put on trial for something that was not a religious issue, but that the Church was so slow in accommodating itself to the evidence as it piled up, because the Church is made of human beings who don't want to admit they're wrong. This was a true tragedy.
The real problem was that Galileo had changed the rules of the game. He was the first astronomer to base his theories on evidence, and the Church didn't like that one bit.
The Catholic Church sponsored and encouraged philosophers and thinkers, including Galileo, as long as what they delivered was simply ideas. But then Galileo, arguably the very first scientist, discovered a way, through experiments, of testing ideas and knowing whether they were wrong. When science started to produce facts, not just ideas, the Church just didn't know what to do. They fought against it.
While the Inquisition's iron grip was stifling science in Catholic Italy, in Protestant Britain, scholars were laying foundations for the next phase of the scientific revolution, the beginning of an explosion of knowledge. In 1609, an Englishman made his way to take up an appointment here at St Bartholomew's Hospital in London. His name was William Harvey, a physician who'd studied at Padua